and that she was a young teenager and he was a man in his 40s. It's difficult for us to accept that.
Mm-hmm.
And
Who
I think
owned
part of the reason
her.
why, yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, thank you for underscoring that. Yes, that's right. Let's make that clear to anybody listening
Yes.
in.
Yeah.
Anybody listening in, took her to Paris, and when they returned to Virginia, she was pregnant with his baby.
Yep.
Run, Mary, run. Run, Martha, run. Run, Mary, run, I say. You've got a right to the tree of life. You've got a right to the tree of life, yeah.
Your opening of this up just reminds me that I think it's important for us to say that Black women did escape. It's not that no Black women ever escaped. Black women did escape. Black mothers did escape, sometimes successfully, but those successes were actually rare. Black women, Black mothers did often engage in short absences, often referred to as truancy by historians, where they would go off for a period of days and sometimes taking their children with them. Sometimes trying to, hide and subsist in the woods with their babies to protect their children from sale. That comes up a lot in the firsthand accounts of enslavement. And so we do see them engaging in behaviors, making decisions that are diverse and that are absolutely stemming from their own personal experience. There's no cookie cutter response of Black women ran or they didn't run, but their children, if they had children, were often a very important part of the equation. And we also see Black fathers who don't want to leave their children. I think it's important for us to note that. Mm-hmm. Again, it's hard for us to get at that because we don't have the kind of historical documents that can help us to really see inside the experience of Black fathers. But we do have some narratives, and one that comes to mind is by Henry Bibb, who had been enslaved in multiple locations and even ended up being enslaved in Indian territory by a Cherokee man. Yeah, did. Wow. And ran away. Wow. He ran away. But he loved his children. He loved his wife. He adored them. And leaving them was horrible for him. He only really made that decision once he realized that his wife had been lost to him.
Yeah. And that is a very important point. And actually, I have to look up that story because we don't see Black fathers in these, even in the narratives where, you have the whole family being depicted in these, and, film and in novels and things. You don't see the dads really wrestling much with it. It's more the mother who has that, tie to those kids. But, you're right. In reality, the father would have those are his kids too. He would have that bond. He would have that. But it's kind of notable that the Black father and Black fatherhood and enslaved Black fathers and Black fatherhood has not come together in pop culture and in mm-hmm. Cultural elements at all. That's something to note right there.
It is. Yeah, you're right. We don't have that film yet, right?
No, we don't. And in the films that we have, he's kind of disconnected, and he's kind of the one pushing the mom and sometimes guilting, her on her decisions. So yeah, that's really interesting. You got me. I've got to ponder that one for a second. But yeah, I mean, it's really the way that I've seen enslaved people depicted in movies. As one of the things that I sort of started looking back when I was told that I was going to be talking to you. I was looking back at, okay, how kind of a survey of how they were depicted in cinema. And I went back to some films that were even as far back as the 40s. Didn't watch them all the way, but just kind of looked, to see. And it's kind of, it was kind of a pattern I saw where you had back then, you had kind of the happy smiling Black person, you had the happy smiling cook, the happy smiling nanny. Even the field slave was, he was smiling, and he was, he had high hopes, and was yes sir, no sir, all that. But he loved the massa, and he loved everything to do with slavery. It was good. He was treated well. And that narrative kind of went on until almost like the Blaxploitation era, where Black filmmakers were able to come in and get like some mainstream support, and were able to say, no, wait a minute, and that's what I think, when that we switched to kind of a more seeking a more realistic depiction. I'll even argue that the controversial film Mandingo was more realistic than films prior to it on how enslavement was depicted. Now, I'm not saying anything about that. No. It's not even in the top 100. But if you look at it compared to the enslaved people in films prior to it, it's so much more realistic. And closer to the facts that you have studied and you have uncovered in your studies than the 1940s smiling and, we're all happy and, they treat us well, slaves, enslaved people. So I just wanted to note that. What do you think of that? Have you ever, kind of come across that type of information or thought about it?
Information or the cinematic representation?
The representations, yeah.
Well, when I was in college, long time ago, I had the opportunity to take a course on Black film, and we did watch films going back to the time period that you're talking about. We watched films. I'm trying to think. I think just going into Blaxploitation, we didn't get a whole lot of that, but I do recall seeing those representations exactly as you described. The happy smiling. I'm so lucky that you own me, enslaved person, which is, of course, a deeply demeaning lie. Terribly demeaning lie. Because not only does it reverse the reality of the history, but it also suggests that Black people, of all people, would be a population who would willingly accept their subjugation, which is basically denying Black people humanity, rationality, sensibility, all of it. It's really horrible. It's really egregious, those kinds of representations. But I will tell you that in all of my years of reading narratives that have been written by or spoken by formerly enslaved people, either in long form or in the interviews that were part of the Works Progress Administration Federal Writers Project of the late 20s and early 30s. I've read this for a long time, and I am still caught off guard. I don't know how this is possible, but I'm still surprised when I read some of these accounts of enslavement, and I realize the extent, the degree, the creativity of the abuse and torture that was involved in some of these relationships between enslavers and enslaved people, because they were relationships. These were people, who were often living in spaces that were, quite intimate spaces, whose lives were intertwined.
Yeah.
Those relationships were, oh my goodness, just shockingly corrupt.
And to me, I think that that's what makes it hard about depicting it into film. I don't think people are ready, because I've only read just a few of the narratives. I've not been through the whole thing. I just read a few, and it was for a project. I don't think people are ready to know just the extent, because I mean, even if you look at the people who couldn't take the news of Sally Hemings being raped and not being in love with, that not being a love story like they've been told for years, people really got irate, and they really had like really significant responses. So if you have a significant response to that, something you saw, you were lied to and told it was a love story, and it was a rape, I don't know, what do you call it, a serial rape story. If you have a problem with that, I don't think you could handle what really went on, and like you said, in those intimate spaces with those relationships, because these people were in survival mode, and when you're in survival mode, you're going to do what it takes to survive. And so we're judging that from our homes, where we are not in those spaces, and we're not under those conditions, and it's and then to put it on screen, where it's already romanticized because it's up there on the screen, so you already have expectations. I don't even think that they could even get away with a film that is completely and totally realistic to what slavery really was. I don't think I could watch that.
Well, I can watch it.
I couldn't watch it.
I promise you right now, I could not watch it.
No. And I've not seen as much as you. I've not seen it. I've only seen just probably a fraction. I couldn't do it.
And then what you said about people making choices to survive, and about Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, just makes me want to take us further down the road of the questions of intimacy, the questions of proximity, the questions of what actually happens in these intensely imbalanced power relations. In the Sally Hemings Thomas Jefferson situation, as you said, it was in our time and in recent decades a history that people have not wanted to face, in part because of the ways that they had really lionized Thomas Jefferson, even some historians, and didn't want to think that I don't know what they didn't want to think, quite honestly, Joe. They didn't want to think that he maybe would have been with a Black woman. They didn't want to think that maybe he would have, taken advantage of somebody and brought her into an exploitative relationship. They didn't want to confront the ways in which someone who has been so important to the development of the principles of this country could have done things that were unethical and immoral in his own life. But people dug their heels in.
Yeah.
Dug their heels in around Jefferson. And then we had some very fine, utterly revealing scholarship produced by Annette Gordon Reed. And then, we had the DNA results. And we realized,
yes.
Or some of us realized, well, this is hard to avoid now. It's hard for us to not recognize now that these two were in a sexual relationship, and that she was a young teenager and he was a man in his 40s. It's difficult for us to accept that. And
who owned her.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, thank you for underscoring that. Yes, that's right. Let's make that clear to anybody listening in.
Yeah.
Anybody listening in, Thomas Jefferson enslaved Sally Hemings, took her to Paris, and when they returned to Virginia, she was pregnant with his baby.
Yep.
So that kind of a situation unfolded in the context of intimate relationships and in the context of the home. And this gets us to something that I think people also don't want to face, which is that slavery was bad in any way, shape, or form that it occurred, outside, inside, north, south, east, west. And we can't really reassure ourselves or comfort ourselves by saying, oh, well, but it was easier because this person was a nicer, master, quotation marks, or it was easier because this woman actually worked in the big house. No, the situations would have been different because these are complex histories that involve human relationships and human choices, human decisions, human behavior. There's a diverse range of how enslaved people actually experienced their enslavement, how they went through their lives, and of how the people who legally owned them treated them and thought about their relationship to them. But that doesn't mean, that diversity, that complexity doesn't mean that slavery was good for anybody.
And it wasn't. And that's the trap that I think we kind of this conversation keeps going into, is when people kind of check out and they're like, nope, I don't want to think about the atrocities. So, and this part of enslavement was better than that part. And it's like, no. And then when we go back to, like we were talking about before, the family and fathers and mothers. So you have these, again, intimate relationships and people doing what they had to survive. And what happens to the family dynamic? I mean, these fathers had to be strong men because they're women. You think of the children. I'm kind of a product of of what happened. Somebody had to. I'm just going to say the babies produced from those that sexual assault of those women. They had to raise them. I mean, their enslavers were not taking those. I mean, in most cases, we're not taking responsibility for that. So you have a father who had to mentally, either decide to, I'm raising this child, I'm adopting this child as my own and raising them as my own, or check out, which was, if it was his right to do so, because mentally, how do you get around that? I don't think we talk about that enough. I don't think we talk about that enough. Just that family dynamic after, we all know how there's so many, shades of Black people today. We know how that happened, but we don't think about the immediate, kind of implications of that. When the family at that moment, when that child that's produced from, from all that activity, when that child is produced, what happens? And the turmoil and the mental just, oh my gosh, it had to be awful. And I think that's another place where we don't go. I don't think people are capable. Do you?
So I'm so glad you brought up the family dynamic. And what I think, in response to your question, is you just described, another horror show. You mentioned that Beloved is a horror film. It is. Mm-hmm. It is a horrifying thought to imagine what it would have been like to try to have a life, to try to care for loved ones, to try to form bonds, to try to be a parent, while always knowing that nothing you had, none of your relationships would be viewed as sacrosanct by the people who had legal and often physical control over you. It is everybody's worst nightmare, probably, to think that somebody's going to have control over you. You don't get to make your own decisions. You may try, and enslaved people did try, and they were incredibly creative and incredibly brave in the ways that they insisted upon creating psychological space, emotional space, relational space for themselves. So you can try, but how horrifying would it be to know that all the structures of society had been arrayed against you, arrayed against your family, arrayed against your ability to care for anyone or love anyone, or especially to protect those who were dependent upon you. it isn't. It is a nightmare. It is a horror show. And, you know, a lot of these relationships that you're talking about, you know, could occur anywhere. They could occur outdoors. Any Black woman was vulnerable to any white man in any, you know, context. And any Black woman was also vulnerable to her enslavers' attempts to compel, coerce, force her to have sexual relations with a Black man so that the enslaver could increase his property holdings. And this happened, you know, across any context we can imagine. So, you know, within the cabins where enslaved people lived, on the roads where enslaved people were being moved about, on the fields where they worked, in the pens where they were held as they were being sold. But you know what happened to Sally Hemings in that house in Paris and in Monticello? So many enslaved Black girls and women were victimized in homes. And I think this completely blows out of the water kind of an older notion that some people have had, that if you were, you know, a quote house slave, you were sitting pretty. You were among this group of people who had an easy ride during enslavement. That is another one of these myths that we really need to dispel, because if you're living in the house, right under the eyes, under the noses, within earshot of the people who are holding you captive, the space that you have to move within to resist shrinks. I mean, don't you think so, Joe? What do you think about that?
I think that's the most dangerous place to be. I mean, it's just like if you're looking at a heist film and that'd be like, okay, you're living in the bank that you're trying to rob, you know? So there's nothing you can do. And the danger, it amplifies to, you know, like an outrageous degree. So I really think that we still have a long way to go in exploring these relationships and exploring the way slavery, the way that time and the way enslavement actually played out in reality. You know, I don't think we're there yet. I don't think we're there to the reality of it yet. Because like you just described, you know, that is a horror story that's not been written yet. And I think that until we've had that story, and until we've had others straight from the narratives, the ones that you've kind of dove into, the ones that are like, you know, that are just horror shows, just reading them, until we've had those kind of brought to like what I call the mainstream, where, you know, and out and about in pop culture, you're going to see depictions, you're going to see it everywhere. I don't think that we can really say that we can. Now, there are people like you who, you know, can't stomach to watch it, and I get that, but I don't think we could stop making those properties.
I don't think we can either. We can't afford to, because film is such an important way that we communicate culturally. It's such a powerful medium, and I think film cannot afford to ignore this history.
No. We're getting close, though. I mean, the Underground Railroad, it was kind of that magical realism of an actual steam train that was actually pretty good, that Barry Jenkins put into that Amazon Prime series. If you've not seen it, it's great. He actually did put in settlements of Black people, and, you know, and the implications of being a Black woman and still being among Black men, who some of them were not the most savory characters, and then, you know, being around white people who were not as safe as they said they were, you know, so the danger was constantly there. And so it had a little bit of what you were talking about, that constant fear. Barry Jenkins tapped into that just a little bit, and I think we're getting closer, but, you know, we're not there yet.
You know, I have not seen the Amazon interpretation or rendition, but I absolutely admired the novel The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead. It was incredibly difficult for me to read. It was so hard to read, in part because, oh my goodness, how did he manage to capture these experiences, even of an enslaved mother, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Cora is so real
Yep.
in that novel. And the circumstances are so real, even though it does get into this space where it wouldn't have been exactly, historically accurate. It doesn't matter, because so much can be conjured and communicated through creative, thinking and creative rendering of these histories. And I think that novel captures much of the complexity of enslavement. And just what you were saying, the fact that really when it comes down to it, people are people. Black people are people,
Mm-hmm.
and we're people. White people are people, and we're people. And human beings are complex creatures.
Yeah.
Run, Mary, run. Run, Martha, run. Run, Mary, run, I say. You've got a right to the tree of life. You've got a right to the tree of life, yeah. Run, Mary, run. Run, Martha, run. Run, Mary, run, I say. You've got a right to the tree of life. You've got a right to the tree of life, yeah. Run, Mary, run. Run, Martha, run. Run, Mary, run, I say. You've got a right to the tree of life. You've got a right to the tree of life, yeah.